Hi, my name is Amelia, and I've coordinated the Against Sexual Violence project with the Goldsmiths Student Union for this past year for our pilot program, and we're really lucky to be here today with Silke of the Not the Only One project, who's going to help us talk and think a little bit about the ways that sexual violence might affect us and community members in a university context. So if you want to talk a little bit about your background, introduce yourself, and we'll...
Thank you for inviting me. So I'm a survivor of childhood sexual abuse, and I'm also a psychologist and a drama therapist. And what I'm doing with the Not the Only One project is basically bringing all of that together to create spaces at universities for students who have experienced sexual violence to come together and, just meet others and support each other and maybe become involved in activism if they want to.
I think maybe if we could talk a little bit about the context and maybe how frequently this sort of thing happens, kind of understand what we're talking about as far as sexual violence and our context here.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point to start with, because I think a lot of us feel like, we're the only one in the world, or no one else can understand that. But actually, we know that it is quite common. So, for example, 1 in 5 people experience some form of childhood sexual abuse. And 1 in 5 women also experience sexual violence, sexual assault as adults. And then it's kind of like around 3.5% of men who experience sexual violence in adulthood. So it is actually quite common. And I think the reason why we don't really feel that in our everyday lives is that we still don't talk about it enough as a society. But it can be really helpful even just to know these statistics and to remind ourselves, like, actually, we are not alone. That's really true. There are likely many people around us who have gone through similar things.
So, as a survivor myself, and I think, like you're mentioning, a lot of folks have either been affected by directly or secondarily by a lot of these issues in our society. I'm wondering if we can talk about some of the ways that someone like myself might experience some of the things that we might feel common effects, ways that we might be coping during or after an incident or something that has deeply affected us, and also what are some of the very basic ways about getting help or starting to do whatever healing processes make sense for you as an individual.
Absolutely, and I think understanding how it affects you is actually a very important first step. So what a lot of survivors, especially in this project, have said again and again is that it can really affect every aspect of your life, and I think that's an important thing to say. It doesn't have to affect every aspect of your life at all times, but it potentially can affect every aspect of your life. And what we mean by that is there are some common responses. Again, you can experience some of them, all of them, some of them at some times. It's really individual how you react to trauma. So in terms of common reactions, one very common response to trauma is hypervigilance, which means that essentially your body is stuck in a kind of ongoing stress response to trauma. So it might mean that you are very hyper aware and alert to anything that's going on around you, which can mean that it's really hard to focus or to relax. So you're in this kind of constant stress state. Also triggers and flashbacks. So there might be just something that reminds you of your trauma, and that usually isn't like straightforward. Like sometimes it's things that we're not even aware of, but it can bring back the stress and the panic and a lot of emotions. It can bring back the memories sometimes for some people, but for a lot of people it just brings back the kind of panic response and the emotions. And on the flip side to all of that is, that your body and your mind might shut down. So it's kind of like a numbness. So you might feel physically numb or emotionally numb, like not feeling anything at all, really.
Yeah.
And I think one important aspect of that is all of that can be quite exhausting. So obviously, you at some point you might just experience kind of burnout, depression like states, or just be really exhausted and tired from this.
So if we're here in a university context and we have students of various age groups and different things, but we're all here for school and we're doing studies and there's social aspects, do you have any information about like how that might affect our ability to, and the ways that we're conducting ourselves in the space? Are there ways that we can think about how really how being in school interacts with some of these issues?
Yeah, definitely. I think it's really important to look at how it can impact our studying and our learning. So I've just mentioned exhaustion and these like fluctuations of too stressed and too numb. And I think generally it can have an effect on your functioning. So I remember when I went to university, like my functioning was like this. So I would be hyper functioning on this kind of high stress response, and then I would kind of crash. And I think whatever your dynamic of functioning and struggling is after trauma, there is some kind of fluctuation in your functioning usually. And that makes it really hard to plan. So, you know, when you get all these nice study tips and like how to plan your study, and you know, it's difficult for people who don't have any big problems already, I think, to stick to that. But I think for students who have experienced trauma or going through these responses, it can make it really difficult, because you can make a plan and then your kind of emotional well-being can be quite unpredictable. So that's like one aspect that we hear a lot from students in the project also, that they say it makes it really hard to keep to deadlines or to keep to my plan, or even sometimes to just attend uni, you know, because you might be so exhausted, or you might be too anxious to go out in the world, and, you know, all of these things. And I think also socially, because sexual violence is, you know, something that is still really hard to share with other people, and also the reactions to it I think are still quite stigmatized, and it's still quite difficult to share that with other people. So a lot of survivors, I think, you know, sometimes we experience feeling quite different from the people around us, or especially if it happened at younger age. But even if it happened recently, you know, it can make you feel like, oh, you know, I don't belong to the world of normal people anymore, or you know, everyone around me is just like keeping going as normal, and I have this totally different world inside myself that I can't share with anyone. So I think a lot of the time that leads to kind of a feeling of being alone, isolated, sometimes even feeling alone if you're surrounded by a lot of people, because you feel so different, and just like your sense of belonging. And I think that's really important in university, that you kind of feel like you belong to, you know, a group of friends, or just generally to your peers, and then feeling that you don't really fit in there, that can be quite difficult sometimes.
You mentioned some of the difficulty might be being able to think in terms of support, or finding someone to talk to, or knowing what those options are, especially if maybe I've heard in a lot of spaces people's stories don't fit exactly what they've seen in the media, or it was a long time ago, or it was only 2 years ago, or it didn't happen here. And especially like in a university context, I think it might seem like the support options are for a narrow kind of definition of someone that might need it, or I've had folks that I've worked with in the past think someone might need it more than me, so I don't want to take into that space. So I think if there's any way we can talk about support options, access to support options, maybe feeling like you have a space to have access to support options, if that comes up at all.
It comes up literally every time we go into universities and talk to survivors, and that's such an interesting thing, and it made me question. So like, I think one really important thing to say is like, do try to get some support is really important, and you deserve support, like no matter if this happened 20 years ago or yesterday or anything in between. Also, a lot of us are quite high functioning in some ways, so that doesn't take away from your need to seek support, you know. It's normal that you like there's a stereotype of, you know, the survivor like rocking back and forth in the corner and not being, you know, not being able to live at all, which is not really what it's like. So we
representative.
We have functioning times, moments, functioning days, and we have like really crappy days. And so it's, you know, I think don't wait for you're struggling to be so unmanageable that you can't not seek support anymore. I wish I had thoughts like of this much earlier in my life. So I struggled quite a long time before I was like, I could actually get support for this, you know?
Absolutely.
And I think, you know, there's also something about sexual violence that, because it is so stigmatized, that it's very easy to feel, oh, I just have to find a way to deal with it on my own.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think because of that stigma, it can be actually really powerful and almost like a healing step to break through that and say, no, actually, I want support for this. I think in terms of university services, you're right, a lot of people have told us like, oh, I'm not even sure if this is a problem I can approach people with. And I think we're working on that in the project, but most of the people from university support services I've talked to, they were quite knowledgeable actually and quite welcoming. So that's like an encouragement. Obviously I can't promise like you can, you know, meet the person who's not responding in the best way, but just don't give up and, try another person. If someone doesn't meet your needs, like that goes for everything.
Yeah, for a lot of support.
Exactly, yeah,
Yeah,
just try
options,
again. But I've met so many people in student support services, in student unions, disability advisors, where, very clear on saying this is clearly an area of my work, this is my responsibility. So even if you might not have a diagnosis, might not have a disability, a recognized disability, you can still go to your disability advisor and they will usually, find that very normal and help you through with that. Other options I think are external support services. I think for the first step, it might be the safest option to go to a specialist support service. For example, Rape Crisis or Solace Women's Aid or Survivors UK is specifically for male survivors. And there was a report where survivors kind of talked about their experiences with support services in general, and they said that these were most helpful and most supportive because they had the biggest understanding. And also one thing that I believe is why these services might be better than general mental health services is because they give you a lot of choice. And a lot of options, and that is really important for survivors.
Yeah,
they might have advocacy or help you report it to the police if you want, or have counselling. A lot of them have support groups. A lot of them have alternative therapies like body-based therapies, creative therapies. Wow. And they're usually very good at letting you choose what you need, which you don't always get in like NHS general services. Yeah.
And actually, Goldsmiths here at the university and the Students Union have been working together on the Larger Against Sexual Violence campaign for about the past 2 years, and we now have in place something called Report and Support, and also, like you were mentioning, the student support services are prepared to help folks find services, whether it's in-house, if they're doing something with the university and working with any of our counselors that are with the university, or finding something that's a better fit for you externally. We have that, and if you check out the description, we have links to the places you can go. There's also a walkthrough video to kind of help talk about what would a support or reporting process look like at Goldsmiths. And I think what's really important about that is it's for students, staff, visitors to the university, and it doesn't have to be something that necessarily has involved or ends with or begins with your time on campus. So something that has happened before, something that you're kind of dealing with, thinking about now. Anything that you being connected to our community might need, you can approach our support services and they'll help you out. So
great. That's really good to know, especially, when people think, oh, it happened before my time at university or it happened a long time ago, they can still approach all of these services. Okay.
So we've talked a little bit about some of the internal and external support options. What about something maybe just like in our circles of friends or family members, someone we feel close to in whatever way, as far as maybe communicating or getting support from some of those spaces as well?
Yeah, I think that is really important because I always say, like, I'm a therapist myself, but I always say, life is always the best therapy, and your friends, like, no therapist can replace your friends and the people around you. And I think so it's really important if you can find a way, if you can find a person that you trust, initially to kind of talk to get some support from your friends or the people closest to you, because they are the ones who are there every day in your life. And I think one thing that has helped me and a lot of other survivors is to really get some clarity for yourself of what you need from different people. So you might need from a friend to come with you to difficult appointments, or you might need a friend where you can call them late at night when you having a breakdown, or and there might be different friends who can provide different forms of support for you, and sometimes it's easier if we ask friends for, or generally people in our life for support, if we say, this is actually what I need, can you offer that to me? Because sometimes otherwise they're like, I don't know what to do.
Where do I begin?
Exactly. Yeah. And the other thing is, I think it's important to acknowledge that with sexual violence, it often happens in the very communities that we would usually turn to for support. So it can happen so the perpetrator can be a friend or a family member. And so sometimes initially it might be easier to ask someone for support who's not in that community. So if it happened in your family, you might want to ask a friend. If it happened in your friend cycle, you might want to ask a family member or a friend from a different kind of friends group. And that's simply because what we've experienced in our work with survivors is that usually the people who are personally involved in that community, they can be quite distracted by kind of managing their own emotional response. and so you want someone who has full capacity to like focus on your needs and on supporting you and on your emotions.
It's really good insight. And we have a second video where we'll be talking a little bit about, if you are a friend or if you're someone in the community, how to do a little bit of managing your own emotional response, and how can you really support someone constructively and compassionately, should you be approached for support as well.
Exactly.
And finally, what are, if I'm discerning kind of the ways that I can process this, or I'm looking to move forward emotionally or deal with some of these things, what are some ways that I can basically care for myself or do healthy coping mechanisms as I'm going through that process?
Yeah, I think, so for me personally, I think the most important step was to kind of understand, in my case, sexual abuse and trauma, and my responses to it. So kind of making sense of it all, because I think some of the reactions that you might have can be pretty scary and intense sometimes, and can make you doubt yourself, and you know, and I think it's really helpful to just kind of understand more about it. So there are some really good books, for example, Trauma and Recovery, or The Body Keeps the Score, that talks about kind of trauma in general, and Breaking Free is kind of that's particular for childhood sexual abuse, but I think it's quite nice that it has a self-help book to go through, kind of through some of your responses and coping strategies. So you know, and also that I think on a lot of organizations, specialist services, they have really good information on their homepages. And I think one point about that, so if you are in a phase where you kind of feel like, I'm reading everything about sexual violence and trauma that I can possibly get in my hands, like that's normal. Every single survivor I've talked to has been there more than once. So that's, you know, it's just you understanding yourself and your responses. In terms of self-care, I think really ditch all the expectations and pressures of what self-care should look like, and figure out what you need for yourself. That can be a bubble bath and candles, you know. It can also be having a list of things that can get you out of a flashback. It can having a list of people that you can call. So self-care doesn't always have to be just me with myself. It can also involve
really important.
Call my best friend, or, you know, reach out to a helpline that I've written down. I think one really good thing is to find some physical activity that helps you to kind of get rid of this overdose of stress hormones that you constantly experience. So that I do martial arts, some people do yoga, some people do football. You know, it doesn't really matter, whatever is good for you. And just try out different things and be creative. So sometimes it might not work, or it might not work for every situation, it might not work at all times. But just kind of keep trying and try out different things, and don't worry about what you should be doing. And also, like, don't get perfectionist. Like, sometimes it's the basic minimum. Like, on some days, like, have a shower. That's it. Brush your teeth. I don't know.
And I think one more thing is the project that you've been working on and is called Not the Only One. And so I wonder, as far as community, or you mentioned activism, working with people who are oriented towards some of the same changes that you want to make, how does that play into, I really liked what you said as far as it not needing to look like you alone in a bubble bath necessarily, but you taking control or exploring options for yourself. So I don't know if there's anything in the, I guess, activism or action realm as well that you have come across.
Yeah, I mean, for me, actually, activism is a form of self-care. And also, it allowed me to have a community where one of my self-care things is just to reach out to them. And I think, actually, for me, it was the biggest change to find a community of survivors, you know. And I think therapy and the kind of traditional self-care can be quite empowering and helpful in terms of managing symptoms and emotions. But I think in terms of, like, how I feel about myself and how I feel about being a survivor, I think that really kind of changed from something that I was really ashamed of to something that I'm almost like proud of, you know, in terms of, you know, I found this amazing community of other people where I can be completely myself. So any thing that you can do to find contact to other survivors, I think is generally really helpful. And that might be a support group, a really therapeutic, safe setting, or it might be an activist group, or it might be anything in between. But just the feeling of, like, sitting together with other survivors and really knowing that you're not the only one, and kind of being understood without having to explain yourself. So you will have, like, loads of people around you who just kind of, you can talk about the most crazy thing that you're experiencing, and they're just all nodding along, and you're like, oh, or where you can kind of don't have to censor yourself, you don't have to omit like
Just
little
received.
things, and where you can also see kind of other survivors and how they are coping. So my self-care is like kind of a random collection of like different things I've stolen from other survivors, what they're doing. And I think also it can be really empowering to see that as not just a personal issue. So that was not just kind of my personal sad life tragedy or something, but it's actually a social issue and a political issue. So just like getting together with others and actually having the agency and the opportunity to make a change. And that can be something really small, like contributing to an anonymous blog, or it can be literally going out there protesting, but anything that you do that creates some change, I think it gives you some of the power back, that you can talk back, that you can claim your experience for yourself, and you can tell your own story. So I would really recommend, if you find any way of connecting with other survivors, to do that.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.